They cut him once. He kept fighting. They cut him 20 times. He still breathed. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, was not merely a pirate, he was a legend steeped in smoke and gore. In the early 18th century, he terrorized the Atlantic with fire in his beard and death in his eyes. But when the law finally caught up to him, it wasn't a clean execution. It was a manhunt turned blood ritual. What makes his death disturbing is not only how much it took to kill him, but how long he refused to die. He did not look human. Not by the time the stories had finished with him. By then, Edward Teach had become something else, something stitched together from gunpowder and whispered blasphemies, a man-shaped curse that bled saltwater and fire. Sailors called him Blackbeard, but when they spoke the name aloud, it was with the hesitation reserved for bad omens or half-remembered nightmares. They claimed his ship could glide through fog when the sea was still, that he could conjure wind, that no bullet could kill him because he'd carved the devil's name into his skin. He encouraged it. He fed the myth like a starving hound, knowing full well what fear did to a man before the first blade was drawn. Born in Bristol to obscurity, Edward Teach shed his name and passed like old skin the moment he tasted salt and blood on the Atlantic wind. He served as a privateer in the War of the Spanish Succession, where the legal slaughter of enemies gave him a taste for sanctioned savagery. But when the war ended and peace returned like a spoiled fruit, he did not come back. He turned south instead, toward lawlessness and legacy. Queen Anne's Revenge, his flagship, was a floating coffin with black sails and rust-crusted cannon mouths yawning like diseased teeth. He painted the decks red to mask blood and mounted lanterns along the rail that burned through the fog like eyes. Below, in the rank dark where bilge water festered with rats and human filth, he stored barrels of rum, powder, and chains, tools for celebration and torture alike. But it was Blackbeard himself who haunted memory more than his ship. His beard was thick and oily, braided into coils like dead serpents and threaded with slow-burning fuses that spat smoke and sparks around his face during battle. Beneath his sash, he wore 6 flintlock pistols and multiple cutlasses, his belt weighed so heavily it bruised his hips, yet he never removed it. Even among his crew, his presence twisted the air, a man who walked like he'd already escaped death once and was daring it to try again. He staged cruelty as performance. Once, drunk on rum and moonlight, he shot one of his own lieutenants in the knee, not for mutiny, but to remind the others what happened when loyalty softened. Another time, he sealed his cabin and filled it with sulfur smoke to test how long he could survive in the choking dark. When he emerged, his eyes were red-rimmed and leaking, but he smiled. "The devil breathes worse," he said, and none laughed. There were rumors, always. That he kept bones in his quarters and whispered to them. That he wrote sigils in blood on the hull below the waterline. That he once cut out a merchant's tongue and nailed it to the mast for asking mercy. But he did not care about coin, not truly. Blackbeard's wealth was terror. He blockaded Charleston for days not to seize gold, but to watch a colony kneel. He let prisoners live sometimes, only to hear them speak of him in trembling voices up and down the coast. It was not piracy. It was theater, violent, unrelenting, divine in its damnation. He did not want to die, but he wanted the world to believe he could not. And that, more than anything, made him dangerous. The British Crown, embarrassed by his desecration of trade and sovereignty, did not name him an enemy of the realm, they called him an abomination. Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia issued an order without precedent: capture Edward Teach by any means, dead or alive, without trial or delay. The bounty was large, but the subtext was larger: this was not justice. This was exorcism. And so the hunt began. But no one knew then, not the sailors sent to kill him, nor the men who placed coin on his name, that Edward Teach would not die like a man. He would die like a storm. And even in death, he would not stop moving. It was November of 1718 when Lieutenant Robert Maynard, a man not yet famous but already marked by ambition, stepped onto the deck of his sloop with a sealed letter in his coat and a sharpened blade at his side. No one saluted him. No drums beat. There was no ceremony, only the creak of damp wood and the stench of sweat and mildew thick in the planks, as 2 low-hulled vessels slipped from the mouth of Hampton Roads into waters that sailors said no man entered without losing something of his soul. They flew no colors. The mission was not official. There would be no admiralty trial, no parchment warrant read aloud in town square. Governor Alexander Spotswood had ordered this death quietly, a private exorcism masquerading as a state favor. The men aboard these sloops were not uniformed Marines, but mercenaries and brutes paid in coin and clemency, some of them barely sober, others already muttering about curses and sea witches. Maynard said nothing to silence them. He let the dread rise. For 3 days, they sailed south, hugging the Carolina coast like carrion birds stalking a dying beast. Ocracoke Inlet waited, shallow, narrow, littered with shoals and bones of wrecked vessels. The wind whistled low, like breath between rotted teeth. The moon waned to a hook. Even the tide seemed reluctant. They arrived before dawn, when the sky was still a bruised smear and the sea reflected nothing. There was no thunder. No storm. And yet, as the sloops neared the inlet, witnesses on passing vessels claimed the mist thickened in unnatural spirals, clinging low to the surface like a living thing. The fog slid between the ship's rails and coiled around men's ankles. Torches flickered blue and hissed out. Below the fog line, just beyond the marsh, Blackbeard waited. His camp was a ruin of driftwood and cloth, half a dozen lean-tos slumped against the trees, the remains of fires buried in wet sand. 20 men, at most. Most were shirtless, some barefoot, all hungover from a night of rum and whores. Their voices were low, the laughter brief, but when the alarm came, a crack of or against hull, they did not scramble. They armed. Blackbeard stood first. He did not speak immediately. He looked to the shore, where 2 shadows moved behind the fog, and then to his men, their skin gleaming with sweat and old scars, eyes sunken from rum and rotgut. He reached for his sash, slowly, like a priest beginning a rite, and pulled free 2 pistols. 1 for each hand. Then the cutlass. Then the knife. Then another pistol. His voice was rough but calm. We'll either live forever, or not at all. He did not shout. He did not pace. He loaded each pistol with hands steady as stone, stuffing powder and ball into barrels that had already killed men in Havana, Nassau, Port Royal. Then he tucked them into his sash, until he looked less like a man and more like a shrine to violence, weapons hanging from his belt like offerings to a cruel god. Around him, his men followed suit, tightening rags around their heads, drawing blades pitted with rust and salt. One of them painted a cross on his chest with tar. Another vomited into the surf and then laughed until he wept. Back on Maynard's deck, the soldiers could see shapes in the fog now. Lanterns bobbing. Voices carrying strange, distorted laughter across the water. Some said they heard drums. One swore he saw a red halo burning over the pirates' camp, a floating ring like fire reflected on black oil. Maynard gripped the rail so hard his knuckles cracked. His boots slipped on fish slime. The fog swallowed sound as it thickened, a hush like breath held too long. And in that silence, the last moments before blood, something shifted. Not just the tide. Not just the air. Something in the eyes of those watching. A tightening. A knowing. As if they all sensed, though no one dared speak it aloud, they were not about to kill a man. They were walking into the mouth of something older. Something that did not bleed like other men. It began with silence. And then, screaming. Maynard's trap was elegant in its cruelty. His deck lay empty, deliberately stripped of movement, sails slouched like a dying bird. Only a few visible men milled about, feigning panic and retreat. Below, in the stifling belly of the sloop, 40 sabers clenched in sweating fists. Faces pale. Some already whispering prayers that tasted like iron on their tongues. The trap was sprung not with a shout, but with a quiet crack, a rope cut loose, and the sudden thud of boots hitting wet wood. Blackbeard had taken the bait. His men surged across the gangplank, their feet slick with blood from a seagull someone had crushed under heel. The pirates howled, the sort of sound that doesn't come from the throat but the spine, unclean, primal, shrill with exhilaration and death. They thought the fight was over before it had begun. Then the hatches blew open. Maynard's soldiers erupted upward, eyes wide with adrenaline, blades glinting like butchers' tools in the dawn haze. The pirates stumbled in confusion, some shouting, some slashing blindly, but by the time the first musket fired, there was no turning back. The deck became a pit of shrieking meat. Blood struck the railings in high, arching sprays. A man screamed as his lower jaw was torn loose by a boarding axe, the tongue still waggling, his eyes already empty. Another dropped without a sound, his ribs split apart like wet bark. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder, sweat, feces, and ruptured bowels. Blackbeard moved through the chaos like a revenant. His pistols fired one after another, the smoke curling from the barrel tips into the torn air like funeral incense. When they emptied, he hurled them aside and drew his cutlass, not cleanly, but with a wet drag, the blade sticking briefly in a piece of cloth soaked with blood. He took a shot to the shoulder early, it spun him, made him snarl. A blade tore across his cheek, leaving a flap of skin dangling like a peeled fruit rind. One of his fingers, nearly severed, flopped obscenely with each grip of the hilt. But he did not fall. He roared, lips pulled back to show yellow teeth, eyes wild, black hair matted with sweat and ash and the trickling red that poured steadily down his neck. He did not speak. Only breathed, short, hard bursts, like a furnace choking on its own flame. A British sailor lunged toward him with a bayonet. Blackbeard caught the shaft, turned it sideways, and slammed the man's face into the deck rail, once, twice, until the nose shattered and teeth burst free onto the blood-washed wood. Another tried to grapple him from behind. He twisted and bit the man's cheek clean off. But even gods bleed. The bullets came again. One to the thigh. One cracked a rib. Another struck his gut, he staggered, hands twitching, a rattling sound escaping his throat. Maynard, blood dripping from his chin, slashed down with a sword that struck shoulder bone and stuck there, the hilt vibrating in his hands. Still, Blackbeard rose. Witnesses swore he held to the mast like a saint nailed upright, his eyes turned skyward, his body glistening with open wounds that steamed in the morning air. Over 20 cuts marred his torso, several deep enough to show glistening loops of intestine or the gray gleam of rib. His breath came ragged, sharp as broken glass, but he took another step forward. One of Maynard's men finally lunged in from behind, slashing across Blackbeard's knees. The pirate fell, not crumpling, not pleading, but dropping like a felled tree, stiff, arms wide, mouth locked open as if trying to speak one last curse that the air refused to carry. And then it was quiet again. Except for the blood. It ran in narrow rivulets between the deck planks, congealing in pools where ropes lay coiled like sleeping serpents. It coated hands, boots, teeth. It dripped from the mast. It painted the boards with a red so dark it looked black in the light. Some said he died cursing God. Others claimed he whispered not yet. But all agreed on one thing, when he finally hit the deck, it was not like watching a man fall. It was like watching something leave. Something too large for flesh. Too angry to stay. They waited for the stillness. Not the quiet of a man losing consciousness, but the terrible hush that follows when something leaves the body entirely, like breath sucked from a room just before lightning strikes. Blackbeard lay on the slick planks of Maynard's deck, chest torn open by blades and bullet wounds, eyes half-lidded, mouth agape in a sneer that had hardened into death. Blood continued to leak from his wounds, thickening into tar at the edges, steaming faintly in the morning air like breath from a dying fire. But Maynard didn't trust it. He stood above the body, panting, skin gray with exhaustion and caked in blood, his or someone else's, no one could tell anymore, and with one shaking hand, he pointed to the neck. Take the head. The command was met with silence. One man crossed himself. Another stared blankly, blinking against the sting of smoke and iron in his eyes. But none moved. The corpse at their feet still bled as if pumping from some hidden reservoir, the pool beneath it widening, seeping into the boots of those closest. The mouth still gaped, not relaxed, but strained, as if locked in a final word unspoken. Now. Two men stepped forward, their blades notched and tacky with dried flesh. One hesitated, then reached into the tangle of blood-matted hair, now stiff and sticky with powder burns, and gripped it like a rope. The neck was thick, far thicker than expected, the muscles tensed even in death, as though resisting the insult to come. The first swing bit deep but stuck. A crunch, tendon or spine, echoed across the deck like a musket misfiring. Blood sprayed in a wide arc, dark and heavy, striking one sailor full in the face. He stumbled back and vomited onto his boots, the sound wet and sharp. The second swing came faster, more panicked. It opened the throat completely but still did not sever. The smell hit next, not just the iron of blood, but the sour rot of ruptured bowel and something deeper, older, that clung to the sinuses like smoke from a burned church. The third swing finally broke the spine. A wet crack snapped through the morning like a snapped mast rope, and the head came free in the sailor's trembling hands. It did not fall limp, it held shape, eyes half open, lips stiffened into that same grotesque grin. Someone muttered a prayer, but the words crumbled before they left his mouth. The body was dragged to the edge of the ship, arms flopping limply, feet leaving thick red trails on the planks. They stripped it of its weapons, tore away what remained of the sash, and kicked it overboard like trash. It struck the water with a muffled thud, more flesh than splash, and began to sink, slowly, as if unwilling. But just before it disappeared beneath the waves, the arms floated upward. Not both, just one, elbow bent, fingers splayed. A final gesture. A twitch. A wave. Or the tide playing games with what was left of a man who had refused to die. The sailors stepped back as if burned. One slipped and fell into the blood pooled near the mast, scrambled back up without speaking, face blanched. They mounted the head to the bowsprit with iron nails driven through the jaw and skull. It didn't swing, it sat stiff, facing forward, mouth slightly ajar, as if whispering something only the dead could hear. The eyes never fully closed. Flies gathered almost immediately. On the voyage back to Virginia, no one slept near the hold. Some claimed they heard boots pacing below deck, not hurried, not clumsy, but slow and rhythmic. Like patrol. Like patience. Maynard did not investigate. His hands trembled when he drank. One night, he woke choking, blood in his mouth, and found a red thumbprint on his throat. They scrubbed the deck with brine and ash, but the stains never fully lifted. The wood remained dark near the mast. Sailors stepped around it, never across. The head stayed on the prow, lips drying, skin tightening in the wind. And every sailor who saw it swore the same thing, that the grin deepened day by day. As though the severance had not been punishment, but invitation. They brought it ashore wrapped in sailcloth already soaked through, the color of iron-rich mud, leaking from the seams like a wound that refused to close. The head of Edward Teach, Blackbeard, was not paraded in triumph but carried with unease, gripped at arm's length by two sailors whose knuckles whitened the longer they held it. It swung slightly between them, bumping against one man's thigh, leaving streaks that dried stiff and dark on the fabric. No crowd cheered. No horn sounded. Only the river wind moaned low between the wharves, like a church organ tuned to grief. At the mouth of the Hampton River, they raised it. An iron spike, blackened from fire and years of salt, was driven into a weathered post that overlooked the harbor's entrance. They mounted the head slowly, with hands wrapped in cloth to avoid direct contact, as if it might still bite. The nail had split the base of the skull to keep it steady, but the mouth, now drawn tight in rigor, curved upward grotesquely, teeth clenched in a permanent, half-snarl. The lips had shriveled, pulling back to expose molars stained with blood and something darker. Bits of beard clung to the chin, still braided, though flies now made their homes inside the folds of hair where the flesh had softened first. The eyes had not closed. They faced the water, milked over but unclouded, pupils locked wide, lidless, ringed with purple bruising that made the whites glow faintly in the morning sun. Fishermen stared once, then looked away. Children cried as they passed with their mothers, unable to explain what had frightened them. Some claimed the eyes followed ships as they entered port. Others swore that at dusk, the head shifted, just a twitch, as if reacting to the wind. By the third day, birds had stopped landing anywhere near it. Gulls circled but would not descend. One cormorant that tried perched on the post for less than a heartbeat before shrieking and flinging itself into the water with such force it broke its wing on the rocks. The air soured. Fishermen hauling nets near the base of the spike reported that the water had grown viscous, green-tinged, fouled with dead eels and half-rotted crabs. The smell of rot spread inland, not only the usual stink of fish and low tide, but a sharper odor, fetid and coppery, like split gut in heat. Nets came back empty or torn, and one crew found their catch chewed through, each fish marked with crescent gouges, as if something had risen from beneath and fed. They blamed it on the head. Stories bloomed like mold. In taverns, where tankards clinked less freely and eyes darted toward the river windows, men whispered that Blackbeard's soul had never gone to hell because it never left the body. That the execution had only angered what lived beneath his flesh. That his body, now bloated, sinking somewhere in the black channels of Ocracoke, walked the seafloor, dragging chains and broken rope, waiting to be whole again. A midshipman swore he saw a man, barefoot, soaked, standing in the shallows before dawn, unmoving, facing the spike. When he shouted, the figure disappeared. The boy refused to return to his post. Another guard claimed to hear chanting one night, just under the tide, as if from mouths not meant for air. Governor Alexander Spotswood called it madness. Ordered more patrols. Dismissed the tales as the drunken inventions of cowards. But his guards disobeyed in silence. No one walked the docks after nightfall. One sailor went missing. Another refused to sail past the spike unless blindfolded. By the second week, the head had changed. The skin blackened, tightening against the bone, drawing the lips back further until the teeth gleamed white as shell. The grin widened. The eyes hollowed but refused to close. Maggots emerged and vanished. Rain fell, but never seemed to wash the blood from its jaw. And still, ships passed under it. Hundreds of them, each crew glancing up, then quickly down, some crossing themselves, others muttering oaths under their breath. Because whatever justice the crown thought they'd mounted for display looked too much like a god to feel like a warning. The sea forgot many things, but not this. Ocracoke Inlet, once a narrow gash in the Carolina coastline marked only by tides and storm-swept trees, became something else after the death of Edward Teach. The wind changed, not direction, but texture. It no longer whispered across the dunes, it hissed, sharp and constant, like a blade dragged over wet bone. Locals stopped calling it by name. Sailors gave it a new one in muttered tones, Teach's Hole, a place where maps faded and prayers faltered. Lieutenant Robert Maynard returned to land not as a hero, but as a man who had touched something he should not have. Though his report listed the mission as successful, though the governor's seal affirmed it in wax, no celebrations followed. No commissions. No wealth. He lived out the rest of his years in slow, downward obscurity, a man unmarked by glory, but etched by something darker. His sword, once gleaming, corroded beyond use. His journals vanished, pages that might have held truth now lost to mildew or silence. He died alone in a borrowed room, eyes wide open, fingernails blackened, muttering incoherent phrases about boots on wet stairs and grins in the mirror that weren't his. Half the men from that mission died within 2 years. One slipped on wet stone and drowned in ankle-deep water, his throat torn open by barnacles. Another drank himself to madness after claiming he saw Blackbeard's face in a mirror, not reflected, but behind him. A third tied a rope to his ankle and walked willingly into the inlet, his body found later, crabs having hollowed the sockets of his eyes, mouth open as if still screaming underwater. Fishermen stopped setting nets near the cove. The catch changed, strange fish surfaced, their eyes glassy, gills flared unnaturally wide, stomachs split with black bile inside. One net came back torn down the center, not by rocks or teeth, but as if burned from within. Nets cast after dark vanished entirely, dragged under without a sound. The shore grew quiet. Too quiet. Birds no longer nested nearby. Frogs stopped singing. Wind moved the trees, but nothing moved beneath them. When a traveling preacher attempted to bless the inlet, a man from Virginia, confident, wrapped in black wool and carrying a brass cross polished to a gleam, he walked the shoreline at dawn, reciting psalms in a voice like thunder. 3 days later, his corpse washed up bloated and green. The tongue was gone, severed cleanly at the root. Locals said crabs couldn't do that. They buried him inland, but no stone was set. The wind tore away the marker before it dried. They say, even now, the Queen Anne's revenge lies there still, splintered, buried beneath centuries of silt and salt, its ribs jutting like a corpse half digested by the sea. Divers who approach the wreck report odd things, lights flickering in unison before blacking out, compass needles spinning like panicked birds, pressure suits tearing without contact. One diver claimed his regulator stopped working only when he hovered above the shattered stern. Another came back coughing blood and refused to speak again. No one stays long in that water. Not because of sharks, or currents, or rational fears, but because there's something there, just beneath, where the blood once bled into the tide. Something that never fully sank. Blackbeard's name has long since left official records, but in bars and on boats, his legend has mutated into something beyond piracy, a symbol, a warning, a specter. Children are told not to speak his name near water. Old sailors still hang rusted nails from their nets, not for function, but but to ward off the teeth in the tide. No one ever says it outright. But they all know. Some deaths end a life. Others stain the world.